Talking about on a topic on which there is wide-ranging discussion and debate in India, as it is elsewhere around the world, and we would hope to gain some insights into President Xi's thinking on Chinese foreign policy and where he wants to take China. So the floor is all yours, Professor Ding Ding, and then we will open this up for discussion and conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Pan, and also RF for giving me this wonderful opportunity actually to hear to learn from you and your colleagues here. And even though I will be talking about the Chinese foreign policy, but I think it's my view that we need to actually learn from how the outside world actually sees China and sees us. And I teach international relations at the Jinan University in Guangzhou, and our university is also called the JNU. So I was very happy to go to another JNU a week earlier, and from JNU in Guangzhou to JNU Delhi. I'm sure we have some JNU people here. And I mostly teach about Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and maritime Silk Road, so on and so forth. And we also have a very young and 4-year-old think tank based in Guangzhou, not in Beijing or Shanghai. So we cover issues like Southeast Asia and Belt and Road Initiative and China's relations with these Indo-Pacific region countries, so on and so forth. So anyway, I think.
Can I request if you can put your mobiles on silent mode, please?
I think what I will talk about today briefly is what I think, in my personal view, that Chinese foreign policy currently looks like, and whether or where China's foreign policy will be going in coming years and even decades. And this is based on a paper that I have been working on for several years, and so I really would like to have your feedback and suggestions. I will divide my remarks into 3 main parts, and the first part will talk about the current, in the last few years, so to speak, some of the foreign policy changes under President Xi Jinping. And the second part will discuss the specific contents of the changes and why we have been seeing all these changes. And lastly, we go back to the big debate and whether it's China's grand strategy or new grand strategy, and where do we go from here. And firstly, the background. I think this is, they are both international background and also domestic background. I think internationally speaking, China has been, in rapid rise over the last 40 years or so, depending on how you start a year. And if 1978 was the beginning of our reform and opening period, now last year was the 40th year anniversary of the reform and opening movement. And China now, from 1978, now has grown into, let's say, a developing / more developed country. It's number 2 economy in the world and number 1 in Asia. And even though China's growth rate has been slowing down a little bit over the last 5 to 8 years, still it's pretty solid number. So if you look at all the top 20 economies or in the world since in last year, obviously U.S. is still our number 1 economy, accounting for about 24% of global GDP. And China has about 15% of global GDP, and 17% if we include Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. And Japan is number 3, and you have Germany, England, France, and of course India. And many people in China, including me before, are not aware of the fact that India actually is a very large economy, and it's ranked number 6 or number 7, depending on the measures. And very soon, I believe, will surpass UK and France, and possibly even Germany, and in coming decade. So I think this is really the global distribution of growth, and to a lesser degree economic power, and to a certain degree military power in the future. So the top 5 economies in the future, I think 3 of them will come from Asia, and China, Japan, India, and also some other emerging economies. And the big question is, of course, when would China or ever be catching up with the US? There are all sorts of different calculations, and we don't know, because this is really based on many assumptions that can change in the coming years. But I think there could be some reasonable calculation that within the next 15 to 20 years or so, I think China's overall GDP size will be more or less the US size, or even surpass the US, depending on the growth rates in the 2 countries. So this is the kind of a background we are talking about when we think of Chinese foreign policy, because foreign policy, in a sense, derives from domestic situation, as we tend to say. And also, the other side of global situation is the current international order being challenging or undermined from both within and without. We mean the US-led global order has been under some pressure for some years, particularly since the end of global financial crisis in 2009. And China clearly sees this as a fundamental shift in global order, and also in that sees both opportunities and the challenges. And I think President Xi Jinping last year during the Central Meeting on Foreign Affairs work meeting pointed out that China is in an optimal period of development since modern times. And the world is also undergoing a change unprecedented in a century or centuries. There's a very popular term we like to use in our domestic discourse is in Chinese is 百年未有之大变局. So it's a big transformation that we haven't seen in 100 years or hundreds of years. So I think that's the kind of mindset we are now talking about within China. So of course, changes do not mean good things necessarily. There can be really some chaos, uncertainty, as we have been seeing from President Trump and all that. I think China has been quite clear about this. There are challenges, but there are also opportunities, crisis, to use the Chinese term, 危机. So globalization is also under a lot of pressure for many reasons. I think people here probably understand that very well already. And global governance is also being challenging. So in China, these are sort of a widely held kind of views, or maybe even consensus, and 3 major ones. The first one is the West, so to speak, led by the US, is in relative decline. So I point out, I wanted to emphasize this is a relative, not absolute decline, because US is still #1 economy in the world. And in the coming decades, nobody in China seriously, think US would be, declining very much or very rapidly. So it's a relative decline. That also means the rise of not only in China, but also the rest of the developing countries. We talk about BRICS, we talk about the G20, so from Latin America to Asia, South Asia to Africa. We all have emerging economies that will be playing a more important role in coming decades and so on. And of course, we believe there are fundamental changes of international order that includes international institutions like the UN, like IMF, World Bank, and also international norms such as environmental norms and human rights norms and many other soft norms. And the current so-called international liberal order is certainly not very resilient, or maybe still resilient, but facing a lot of challenges. But China is we believed that it's faced with a new international strategic environment, and we believed it is also a period of strategic opportunity, and this would provide, in many aspects, China and also other developing countries like India, many strategic opportunities. So what have changed in the last 5 or 6 years since 2012. By the way, I would like to emphasize that whatever we have been talking about the Chinese foreign policy and the major changes of Chinese foreign policy did not start in 2012. And that's a misperception widely held by some outsiders, believing that it was all about President Xi Jinping, which is not true at all, because the fundamental shift or turning point is really the global financial crisis. And that gave the Chinese, as a country or the leadership, more confidence that our system is more or less effective. We have problems, we have weaknesses, of course, but we survived the global financial crisis, and we will continue to grow until today, and that gives us a little bit of more confidence. So whatever you have seen, I think, it's not a result of the 2012 leadership transition. It really goes back to at least 2009 or 2010, even way back to 2000. So that's an academic debate, but I think it's important to point out. So I think this is the major changes are very familiar to everybody in this room. The AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is a major initiative. Obviously now it's more inclusive, it's multilateral, it's not just China's initiative. And even the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is more inclusive than some perceptions would indicate. And we have some other major events or diplomatic meetings like G20, the BRICS, and the CCAR summit, so on and so forth. And there are a number of institutions, I think, in recent years, either set up by China or led by China, that are becoming, let's say, more important in regional affairs and the global affairs. And we at the 19th Party's Congress, of course, in China, declared that we are officially entering a new era of development. That a new era means mostly actually domestic developments, because we believe from the 19th Party Congress 2017 to 2049, supposedly the China dream will be realized by 2049. It's still a long way to go, 30 years of work, and there's a sort of a two-stage strategy or plan. That's again mostly about domestic development. So by 2035, China would become more or less all around the modernized country. That means economy, technology, military, and even soft power. And by 2049, that's when the China dream will come true, more or less. So 2035, I think, I don't know how the year was, decided. It's 2035. It could be totally random, but I think it's also a time, roughly speaking, China's overall economic size will be catching up with the U.S. based on previous numbers and the trends and all that. So maybe maybe it's some kind of a coincidence, maybe it's not. But anyway, it's interesting. I think we have these two step sort of strategy, mainly focused on domestic development. And again, domestic development is and will be our number one priority, I think, in my view, before 2049. So all of these worries or concerns about China's expansion, in my view, is kind of misguided, because I think before 2049 we have a lot of domestic and pressing issues that we needed to address before we can really talk about some external ambitions, so on and so forth. So peaceful rights or peaceful development has always been the dominant discourse in the last 30 years, and will continue to be until 2049. But the tactics will be a little bit different, because a lot of people talk about Tangguan Yanhui hiding your strengths and all that, and that seems to be now, I wouldn't say completely disregarded, but at least a little bit not emphasized as before. So now we talk about, at least in the last 5 years, talk about how to make things happen. So I think, again, to explain that, I think the three reasons. One is always, as an IR scholar, we tend to focus on realistic, theoretical framework, and the power being one of the most important factor in that. So the overall power status has improved. That paves the foundation for all these new developments, change, and more importantly, I think is the new identity. I think, in my view, this is a century long unresolved issue, and I think we are in China. We're still sort of uncertain about our own identity, meaning our relations with the world and our relations with other countries, because for the last 100 or 50 years, the victim discourse has always been very, very deeply with us, and now people are beginning to talk about a new identity, but nobody really knows what that new identity should be like, and especially the relationships with other countries in the world. So, and of course, the new leadership also plays a role, even though it's a minor role, not as important as others would indicate. So new power, new capabilities, don't need to mention that, economic power, military power, naval building, science, technology, and all that is all part of this new increased capabilities. And identity, history, and the new ambitions. I think we have a philosopher from CAS Beijing talking about the new concept or modified concept of 天下, everything under the heaven. It's an old philosophical concept from Chinese history, somehow got picked up by some IR people, but it's very controversial even within China with regard to what exactly does that mean. I mean, it's not clear to me. It's not clear to many outsiders either. But I think it's safe to say, though, the world is changing. It's changing. It's just we just don't know how exactly we should go about that. But I think a lot of the Chinese behavior and the actions and intentions can be explained by the history, philosophy, and the culture, perhaps like in India. And of course, we have very ambitious leadership these days. Again, this is not an isolated case. You look around the world, there is this so-called emergence of strongman politics all over the world. So it's maybe a global trend, and we are talking about a major country diplomacy. And since 2012, and the Belt and Road Initiative has been our sort of a signature foreign policy project, and it is first of all domestic, and second of all foreign policy, because we faced a lot of domestic development issues like overcapacity, how to climb up the ladder, so on and so forth. So it is first and foremost a domestic issue, but certainly has foreign policy and geopolitical implications. And I would like to point out the first phase of the Belt and Road Initiative, the first 5 years is gone, it's finished. The second phase is actually more difficult because we now need to demonstrate all these projects we, being, investing can be sustainable and can be profitable, even to the, including the local partners. So that's going to be a very, very serious, challenging in the next 5 years or so. So, anyways, I think the peak of the BRI publicity is gone. We will hear less and less about this grand, plans of Belt and Road Initiative, but instead will be focused more on the concrete projects, a dam project there, a railroad project, another place, and how that can be more effective or sustainable. So I think this, in one way, also is responding to the outside worries that this could be sort of a grand geopolitical plan, which from the very beginning was not and will not be anyways, in my view. And major country diplomacy also means that China will be, making policies more from its own sort of objectives, not really like before responding to outside events and pressures. I think so. You will see more China-oriented actions or plans instead of maybe responding to the U.S. or some other forces. So I think this is a principle. So you don't see perhaps much concrete actions, demonstrating that. But I think it's one thing we needed to keep in mind if you wanted to understand Chinese foreign policy in coming years. It's a major country diplomacy, and because it used to be the case, Chinese foreign policy, for good or bad, has always looked to the West or the U.S. for cruise and whatever. But now it's changed, and a lot of the actions will, I think you will see, will be coming from China itself for its own sake. So based on all this, I think it's still debatable, but for me, I think China has kind of developed a new kind of a strategic framework, and I think whether you wanted to call it a new grand strategy or not, I think it's debatable. But I think there's some elements of that new grand strategy that will stay with us in coming years and decades, and particularly because of the global uncertainties that will also persist for a long time. So when it comes to China and the international order, whatever you want to call it, international liberal order or not, I think there is the worry that China wants to kind of overthrow that order. I think that's not correct. I think China, for a very simple reason, has actually benefited a lot from this, whatever you want to call it, this international order for the last 40 years, benefiting from UN, benefiting from IMF, World Bank, now Asia Development Bank, AIIB, and everything. So there's no need for China to overthrow this beneficial order and set up its own order. It's not wise. So I don't think that's happening. But China would like to, like other developing countries, to have a bigger voice, so to speak, in those institutions and in that order. And so it's a process of reform instead of radical change. And I think and related to this is whether China can play the role of leadership. I think it's still too early to talk about China being a global leader for many, many reasons. I think that discussion can only be meaningful discussion when we move closer to 2049. And there's a big if. In the if, there's only meaningful discussion if China becomes the number one economy and perhaps major tech power and the military power. And now it's not there yet. So any that kind of a talk is premature. I think we need to wait. So still, I mean, whatever China does in the coming years will have an impact on international order, even though it's going to be incremental, like Professor Yin Xietong from Tsinghua University has also pointed out. He believes the essence of establishing a new international order is power struggle and the redistribution. However, power struggle is not a determinative factor for the order's type, since every type involves such a struggling. It's misguided to classify order by power distribution. So I think here there is a broad consensus view that power alone cannot guarantee our success in whatever we do. So we don't want to rely on pure power, brutal power alone, because that's going to be a big mistake. And we do need to rely on institutions and even soft power. And therefore, participation in the reform would be really, really the best strategy for China in the coming years. Having said that, I think there will be no denying that there will be a little bit, maybe more competition between China and the U.S. and the West, very broadly speaking, even though there are many, many differences between the U.S. and the other countries. And this was very clear from the U.S. side when in 2017 they released the National Security Report. I think under Trump, China was first time in 40 years identified as sort of a major rival. In other words, the enemy. And I believe that's extreme, but that's the view of some people there. And certainly it's not in China's interest to confront or challenge the U.S., and it's not in China's interest to, even though, be in a competitive, mostly competitive relationship with the U.S. I think for China, it's still very much a cooperation-oriented relationship with the U.S. And so, but you have to get prepared to the new normal, so to speak. And that, I think, new competition and not only between China and the U.S., but also maybe some other parts of the world, is something new we have to deal with. And I think it's safe to say nobody has clear ideas how to go about that. I don't think anybody in the U.S. has clear ideas about how to, deal with China from a very strategic and comprehensive point of perspective. It's just something really new for the last century. And some people say it's a mostly economic competition. Some people say it's mostly political. Some people even say it's ideological. Some more extreme people say it's civilizational. I think that's wrong, but that's a view they are held by some people. That only tells you that this is a very complicated new relationship. And none of us has answers, but I think maybe that's not a necessarily bad thing. That's a precondition for us to maybe create something new out of this. So, I think China's leadership is very, very clear about this. And the two principles I think will follow. One is it has to be more or less incremental transformation. It cannot be radical, because the radical transformation would create a lot of uncertainties and chaos and damage for all of us. So it has to be incremental. And the second, it has to be collective. So it cannot be China alone, because we understand power alone is not enough, and that has perhaps created a lot of problems in the last century. So there has to be collective effort, including China, BRICS countries, G20, US obviously will play a very, very important role. And so it's all inclusive. It's a new type of international relations China wants to promote, new type of greater power relations also China wants to promote, but it's not really quite understood by others, and I think it's completely understandable, but I think that's the goal China wants to achieve if we wanted to achieve peace and stability for the whole world. So I think in coming years and decades we'll see more initiatives coming out of China, and whether they will be welcomed or not, I think we have a lot of debates, a lot of issues we understand, including China's political system and all that. But I think that's something we all have to resolve. So finally, community of shared future of mankind, I understand it can be a little bit too big, too empty slogan for some people, but I think there is actually a lot of substance behind this, and particularly in Southeast Asia, I think this is more than just an empty slogan. It has some policy substance behind that. So I think that will be continued, and BRI, of course, but I think the rest of the journey, I think is very, very uncertain. I think I will just stop here and would like to have your feedbacks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chen. And before I open this up for discussion, can I ask you two very limited questions? I think that would be one is, you framed this power, identity, and leadership troika that you framed. The question is, can identity be divorced from the power realities, or power attributes themselves have an ability to shape identity? So while one can argue that China can construct its own identity along the domestic debates that China is having, but the fact that China is today one of the most powerful countries in the world will also mean that there are that a certain identity will be imposed on China as a country that is now one of the biggest players on global affairs, and that manages its periphery in certain manner, etc., etc. So therefore, I very much doubt if we can have these two arguments in isolation. So what is the impact of that power dynamic on the domestic debates that China is having about its own identity at the moment? If you can elaborate that. And I think for some in the audience, it would be useful to hear your views on the present state of Sino-Indian relations. Okay,
I agree with you. There's no separation between power and identity, and as some realist scholars would argue, power, would necessarily sort of create offensive identity, so to speak, because as your power grows, you tend to have a bigger appetite, wants more, wants to expand and all that. But I also think that it's a danger in maybe too closely associating these two not separate variables, but certainly not different, are different things. I think that's the kind of view we also in China try to avoid, because power grows, whatever grows, does not necessarily drive your self-perception of identity or your identity, your perception of others or that relationship. I think there is a tendency, of course, if you look at the history, the Harvard scholar Graham Allison wrote a book about this Thucydides trap, basically, connecting, rising power and sort of new appetite and new identity. And even in his book, even by his own standards, 16 cases of power transition, you still have 3 or 4 cases of peaceful transition. So I think that's very, very important historical lesson. So we don't have to follow this very overly pessimistic view of, but I hope that's what we try to avoid. But I think, on the other hand, we needed to clearly understand this kind of a tendency maybe arising from power growth and all that. India and China, I think, I've been here for how many days? 8 days. And I'm more optimistic now. And why am I more optimistic despite the recent, you see from the newspaper? I think it's because I look at 2049. If I look at 2020, next year, I would be less optimistic. I could be even a little bit maybe pessimistic about India-China relations. But when I look at 2049, what do I see? see, I mean, if things hold the current trends, the patterns continue, I mean, weird things can happen, right? There's no guarantee. But things move the way they are moving today. By 2049, China and India would be the top two economies in the world, possibly. And, I mean, that's unprecedented. That's unprecedented in the last 500 years. Have you ever seen such big transformation in the last 100 years? No. Can you even imagine that? I mean, even right now, right here, it's still very difficult for me to imagine. By 2049, India and China will be the two most powerful economies in the world. For me, it's still shocking. I cannot believe that myself. But if you believe rational development, if you believe science, if you believe development theory, you have to follow that conclusion. Because of your population, my population, and your development structure, and your leadership, and your culture, your history, your philosophy, and everything, I'm optimistic. Because of that, why we focus so much on some of the, well, maybe I'm biased, small issues in my mind. Those to me are small issues. Well, I don't want to, be too unrealistic, but I'm saying we have a bright future ahead of us, and even much brighter if we work together closely. And why not? And we had historically worked together closely for thousands of years. Why can't we do that now? I mean, this is not obviously, I mean, a dominant view in China today, but my point is you have to keep your eyes on the big prize. When you do that, you see opportunities. If you don't do that, well, I'm not making decisions, so yeah, I'm just one person. You could make, you could miss opportunities. That's all, all I can say. So I'm optimistic about India and China. And even for the medium term, I'm still optimistic. I think you have a very strong leadership. Your Prime Minister is very determined to develop India in a comprehensive fashion. And our leadership is also determined to develop. Development is the #1 priority for both of our countries. Maybe not for other countries, but it's for us, it is. Because I think poverty, we still have a huge number of people living under poverty. That for me, I think Gandhi once said, I read a book, bought a book about Gandhi last week, and it made an impression on me. Gandhi said, poverty is the worst form of violence, and I completely agree with that. We needed to eliminate that form of violence, and I think we have a big responsibility.
Yeah, I'm opening this up for your questions, comments, and observations. Maybe the back.
Hi, I'm loud enough. So I just want to get a rationale behind why China has not solved the boundary issue with India. It has literally solved with literally all the countries. What's your take on that? Thanks.
Can you take a few questions?
Sure.
I have a question regarding the point that don't you feel that the recent Hong Kong protests that are taking place, don't you feel that they are going to spill over, broaden, and don't you feel that there could be a possibility of democracy maybe in the next decade or maybe near future, because China is considered to be too much centralized and subsidizes its state-owned units too much. And my second question is regarding the current trade war and the currency war. Don't you feel that that will hit the exports and because most of the success of the China is considered because of these exports and the manufacturing success.
My name is Dr. Subramaniam. I was a senior official in the government of India. I came here mainly to find out what are any new ideas which are coming up in India-China relations. I was in China recently, having a discussion in the post-Modi scenario. And what I found was the Chinese are very keen to cooperate internationally with India. And they in fact asked me to make a presentation on India-China cooperation in the international sphere. So I made a presentation. And what I found during my research, that Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I hope you have heard of it.
I'm from Guangdong, but I'm heard.
Shanghai Cooperation Organization set up by Russia and China for the purpose of developing relations with developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and so on. And they prepared a strategy for developing relationships. And it's a tremendous conference they had recently in Shanghai. And they produced a document. The document is very, very impressive. The whole conceptualization of Xi Jinping. It is very impressive. I have taken community of what it is. So you haven't spoken about it at all. I'm surprised that in the whole world, the largest number of countries, population in the world, are from the developing countries. Why is it that you have not mentioned it?
He will now. He will.
Shanghai.
You don't expect it. 30 minutes. Yes, he will. He will. Yes.
Sir, you projected China's image as a world leader, but it's not something bizarre that every country, not only the India, is resisted against China. What is in China that every country is resisted? It means that China, look at China or India. We have India enjoys one of the biggest democracy and China enjoys such a communist regime. I think that the people felt that even in China, that China is not good and oppressive types of society. And second, my question is about what's China's view in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is one of that country in 1950 who adopts communist China. But after that, relations with go further with the Hamid Karzai relations. But can you fill the vacuum which America put up after taking his troops into America? What's your view on this Afghanistan policy?
We take this round of questions. As you can see, China is truly a global power. You cannot escape the fact that Central Asia, Afghanistan, there was a question on Hong Kong. So you have lots of questions here to answer, and your plate is full. So I'll take 4 questions at a time so that you can answer them.
But I don't have answers, so we're not a global power. Boundary issue, I mean, it's, how should I say, it's an issue, if I were in charge, I would like to resolve tomorrow, today. But it's complicated, I guess, from a historical point of view and all that. I think it will be resolved. Not this year, not next year, maybe not in the next 5 years, but it will be resolved. On the other hand, I think, like I said, I'm looking at the 2049, right? So do I want to, let this issue, to stand in the way before us in the 2049? I think the answer is clear. I think it's for both of us to find a way to resolve that. And I would also say from a maybe purely IR academic point of view, I think the concept of sovereignty needs to change. And it's a concept, and from a pure academic point of view, it's a concept that has, created opportunities, but today, but also maybe some new uncertainties. And from a theoretical point of view, I mean, it's debatable. I think maybe there is, old concept or new concept, shared sovereignty, or whatever you want to call it. I think there are many ways, creative ways, that we can address this issue. Hong Kong, no, I don't worry about that. I'm from Guangzhou. We are only 40 minutes away from Hong Kong by high-speed rail. And you know why we don't worry about that? I mean, the reality is Hong Kong is not important to us anymore. Hong Kong's GDP is only 3% of mainland China's GDP. Shenzhen's GDP, Shenzhen today is a city. 40 years ago, was not even a village. It was all empty, seawater everywhere. It's nothing. But Shenzhen's GDP is bigger than Hong Kong's GDP already since last year. It will only be bigger than Hong Kong in the coming years. Even my city, Guangzhou, relatively backward city, will catch up with Hong Kong in 2 or 3 years. Hong Kong has nothing left except maybe more or less financial center. Why do we worry about it? From pure sort of rational kind of view. Nobody envies Hong Kong today. Not like me. When I was growing up in 1980s, we all envied Hong Kong, Taiwan. Now nobody wants to go to Hong Kong even for a job. The living standards Hong Kong, for some super rich people, very nice, but for the vast majority, I don't want to go there. So young people in China, well, I don't want to go there. You do whatever you like with your lives, not getting jobs, education, and all that. Fine with me. We don't envy you.
Do you think CIA has a hand That's what people are saying now.
I didn't see a hand, but there could be smokes. I guess. I don't know. But I think that's not the main issue. The main issue is what Hong Kong people want for themselves. It's an identity issue because for the last since the handover, they have not really identified with the mainland China, us, so to speak, for whatever reasons, education, history, economic, political, whatever reasons. That's the root problem. It will be resolved sooner or later. But trade war, I'm coming from a province where 1/4 of China's international trade is from my province, Guangdong province. Last summer, we were very worried for the exact things you just mentioned. Factories will be closed down and they will move to Vietnam and Malaysia, India, and anywhere else. And we have a massive capital outflow. But that was last year. After 1 year, because Trump officially started the trade war last January 5th or 6th. Big scale trade war. 1 year has passed. Well, I'm not an expert on economy, but I think the last year growth was 6.3, more or less depending on your perspective. This first year, 6 point something. So I think as long as you stay above 6, that means you are okay, more or less okay. So those worries did not materialize. Factories, some shut down, but the process started 3 years ago because of a high cost, labor, environment, whatever. Some moved to Vietnam, that's true, but every year we have companies, factories going out to other countries, some to India. It's a natural process. Capital outflow has not really become a big issue. So, well, you have to look at the numbers to adjust your policy. I think for the moment, it's okay. But then again, the issue is if this continues for another 6 months, 1 year, we'll be in maybe more trouble. But we believe the U.S. will also be in big trouble. So does every other major economy. So it's hard to say. At this moment, I think it's fine. We're not worried about these very big economic losses. Afghanistan, we don't want to go in. Nobody wants to go in. Why go in? If the U.S. left, the U.S. left. it would be a regional collective effort, I believe, involving, first of all, India, China, Pakistan. Regional effort, not a US effort, to stabilize the country, the region. I think it's our responsibility. We have to make a collective effort. I don't think any single country cannot do that. And the root issue again is development. You don't have development, people starve, they tend to violence, they tend to extreme, activities. I think that's the root cause. But that takes a lot of time to address. So I don't think the US would be able to fix the issue just by leaving and all that. Yeah.
Sir, my second question is all about it.
Which one?
Let him pick and choose what he wants.
We can discuss later.
There was a question about SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Yes, I think India is also part of it right now. So I think it's more, India and Pakistan more inclusive, collective, and yes, very important. Agree, completely agree. It's kind of sort of old. It's like more than 5 years old. So.
One of our army chiefs recently in his book, he mentioned that leaders of both the countries, China and India, they have not done enough to educate people of their countries about the border disputes, because the borders have been drawn, as Lord Curzon, I think 100 years back, he mentioned in his address at Oxford, they have been drawn in very arbitrary manner. People who did not have any knowledge of frontiers, or did not have knowledge about the people there, or about the topography there, or other issues, they have been responsible for drawing these frontiers. You can see anywhere in the world. So do you think this statement is correct, that people in India as well as in China, they are not enough to educate their children, and people have almost hardened their stance? They do not want to change anything from this, either they want to give, or rather take also. I mean, take they will, of course. They don't want to give an inch to the other country and to resolve the problem. So how long this problem will continue? Thank you.
It was a feast to listen to Professor Chen Ding Ding and later on respond to the concerns so articulately raised by Harshvi Pant. What I want to emphasize here is China and India both are ancient civilizations and both are Asian giants. Their destinies also perhaps intertwined with each other. There will be many forums in international order where China and India have to stand together. Now this is the time when China has got a strong leader, India has got a strong leader. And fortunately, these two leaders have got very good dynamics, very good interpersonal relations, whether it was, sharing a swing in Ahmedabad, or whether it was informal Wuhan summit, or whether it is now going to be another informal summit when Xi Jinping visits India, or whether it was Dr. Jaishankar's visit to China. So what I'm saying is China ready to take our relationship to a new level, to a higher level? And why not have defense cooperation and have joint defense exercises and have cultural interaction, whereas, two great languages, Mandarin and Hindi, they should also be the exchanges, there could be centers in India to teach Mandarins, and Indian professors also can go to China and teach Hindi, so that there is an amalgamation of people to people, and then at the top level and the bilateral exchanges, so that these two giants, which are going to be big economy and top economies of the world by 2049, which is so appropriately spelled out by you. So they should have more things in common, and they should write a common destiny, and they should be able to show the world, and they both should be able to claim their place under the sun, because India has been a Vishwa Guru, if you know this term, and we believe in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the complete world is our family. And China is also, moving towards, and it is understanding the realities and understanding the importance of taking India along and taking its neighbor. So I hope you got my question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chen. I was just inquisitive about you saying that. I was just inquisitive about you saying that the international order has to reform. So I was wondering, what role do you see India playing in those reforms? And besides, I was wondering about Yan Shuitong's Wang Dao Zhuyi, the rule of virtue. Would that play a bigger role in the change that is going to happen? Thank you very much.
I'm A.J. Singh from the Indian Maritime Foundation. I have two questions, one slightly provocative one, and the other the regular one. Your whole talk this afternoon, which is really very interesting, was all about China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping, or after his time. 2049, we understand why the date 2049 exists. And as you said, 2035 is a figure that's been arrived at, for whatever way. But do you think that this sort of leader for life, total authority, giving these very determined timelines, can this become a vulnerability also later? If it doesn't sort of pan out and doesn't deliver on the outcomes that are expected, can this become a vulnerability? Can it lead to internal tensions, internal disturbances of having one sort of powerful leader like this whose writ runs? Because when you become that powerful, you're only told what you want to hear. Nobody has the guts to tell you what you should be hearing actually. So that's one. Second question pertains to the PLA Navy. The PLA Navy has grown at an unprecedented rate over the last 20 years. No Navy in the world has maintained that sort of pace of growth. You're commissioning 20 to 25 major warships a year. And I think numerically you're already bigger than the US Navy. In a few years, even capability-wise, you'll probably be on par with the US Navy and the 4 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and all actually happen. There's a saying that it takes 3 years to build a ship, but it takes 300 years to build a Navy. Now, when you build at this rate at which you're building, and you're building very sophisticated warships, destroyers are being commissioned on successive days, you need the kind of manpower, the technical skills, the experience, it's an ecosystem that has to be created. How are you being able to create this ecosystem as fast as you're delivering ships, growing a navy which in 50 years will become the largest navy in the world? These are 2 questions.
Okay. I do agree that with regard to the border issue, there's a lot of mutual understanding and that kind of a learning that we needed to promote and do much better. I think again, it's a larger issue because I think I have to say, I mean, within China and including me, getting my PhD in the U.S. and stayed there for a long time. We have a tendency to look toward the West, not so much on our neighboring region for whatever cruise or whatever. So I think that's a weakness, and that's why we to some degree lack adequate understanding of India and also other countries as well, Japan, many others. I think in China now, I think in the last 5 years, there is this rise of area studies in the regional studies. I think that's an indicator that people are beginning to take this very seriously. We wanted to understand this area, this region surrounding us and nearby. So I think and I hope that it would improve. But most things can be done, and that is one factor, but obviously not the only factor. So I think education-wise, we could do much better. And to you, I would say, yes, I completely agree, and a lot, at the different levels, a lot more can be done. And I think your proposals are excellent. I hope they will be heard by our leaders. And again, if you look at the 2049, I think India should, right now, maybe you are already preparing for that. You should be prepared for 2049. 30 years is like this, it's gone. And you have a big role to play, whether in Asia or in the world. and you have a lot to contribute philosophically, I mean, culturally, economically, many ways. And of course, being here the first time, I don't really understand this, older civilization and all that. I think if people are not beginning to think that way, they should, because it will come fast, very fast, during our lifetime. We're going to be witnessing that. And there's a lot of work to do, I think, India. For Yan Xuetong's work, I think I'm trying to, you can, of course, teach me and others. Is there sort of equivalent to the Wang Daozu in Indian culture?
I think Ram Rajya, that's
Yeah.
The
Right.
kingdom of Ram, if you know, maybe probably is somewhat similar to one.
We should know. I mean, that's the kind of a comparative study we should do, because Wang Daozu, whatever, I don't think it's unique to China. I mean, older civilizations, they are older civilizations precisely because they have learned something very valuable in thousands of years, how to deal with external, internal challenges. So I think China's internal system, I think every system has its own strengths and weakness. We do. We have a weakness. We have a lot of weaknesses, of course. And that's why we emphasize on constant reforms. You cannot stop. Once you stop reforming, you become rigid, you become confident, too confident and arrogant, maybe. I think we understand that. I think that's the issue. Many issues we will address. And I think my belief is the leadership is aware of this. And there will be ways and methods to address that, I think and I hope. And the Navy, I completely agree. It's not about the ships. Again, like I said, it would be a tremendous mistake to believe that you can count on number of ships, number of missiles, whatever, the brutal military power. I think that's a huge mistake we should avoid. So they're increasing the number of ships, but I don't think that's their ultimate source of confidence. I don't think it's never that. You can have ships, but you can still make mistakes. You can win wars, you still lose. That's our lesson, perhaps learned from the U.S. 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You win, but you lose. I think it's not that simple.
So my question is about Sino-Bangladesh relationship. At a time when China is striving hard to become a world leader, why can't we see that China is able to address the challenge which is existing between Myanmar and Bangladesh regarding the repatriation of Rohingyas, which we haven't seen that Bangladesh has repatriated back into Myanmar till now. And the second one is about, sir, the certain articles that has popped up in the Economist, leading newspaper, magazine of West, about some detention centers of the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province of China. Please shed some light on that, sir.
Okay, yeah.
I just want to take your opinion on how China's foreign policy towards Africa is going to be like over the next 3-4 years. So recently, China has lent heavily to African economies mainly for infrastructural projects. But with many of these coming to close or having been constructed, the viability of these projects are in doubt. So there are a lot of concerns about the repayment capacity for these countries. Do you think China is still going to keep the credit lines going, or are these credit lines going to freeze over the next 3-4 years?
You see President Trump's application of global leadership as systemic or continuing of resource protect presidency? Does the US actually want to accelerate China's rise, or is it part of the systemic plan? Second, the US has weaponized it all by threatening to cut off access to New York's dollar pipeline. It is imposing its will on many countries on things like buying oil from Iran or doing business with Huawei. You just need to announce secondary sanctions. You will ban any entity that deals with the sanction regime from having access to the New York dollar. This weaponization of the dollar can be done only if you have a system of settling international payments without the dollar, at least when there is no US counterparty. Now, nobody seems to be in a position to create such an alternative payment system. Is there any thinking within China about it?
One is about this strategy, string of pearls strategy, because that has been something which had been considered as a bit of a problem by several international powers, and still it is the understanding is that it's still happening, number one, and it's connected to BRI and UBOR and all that. So therefore, what do you think is the response you can give to the protests which you hear from various countries about the process? Second thing is about South China Sea. You are having your neighbors are having problems with you, and even some other powerful countries also. They may having various issues with you on this matter. How are you going to justify what is happening from that end in the South China Sea, island development islands, and making them somewhat militarily powerful units? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll get one final round.
Okay, sure. I have to admit I don't really know much about the Bangladesh and that part of it's my ignorance, and I don't have much to say about that. On Xinjiang, I think it's an important issue, obviously, to China, and I think there are things I think that can be improved, obviously, but. What worries China is the separatist activities and tendency and terrorism and all that. So I think that's the backdrop within which we can understand that kind of phenomenon we are talking about today. So I don't think it's intention to do whatever the newspapers say they're doing. I think it's
they are
really
biased, sir.
Huh?
The Economist is a biased magazine. I do believe that.
I read it every day. I read everything. So
that's my personal opinion, sir.
Yeah.
That's my personal.
Even biased, we can learn something from it. But anyways, I think. But I would say they should be a little bit more transparent. They are inviting, I think, Turkish group to pay a visit. They should, invite others to visit, to see, it's not the kind of facility that people are talking about. And Africa, I think Africa is also, without a doubt, one of the most important regions and continents and areas for China. I think a lot of the issues, concerns, actually China is aware of that. That's why in the second stage of Belt and Road Initiative, that sustainability will be a very important issue. I think we have learned that it is important for some countries that has to be sustainable. Otherwise, it's no good to the country, it's no good to China either, because we don't want that to happen. I think that issue can be addressed. I think we are going to see some improvements, of course, and the ministries are now looking very closely at all the projects, whether they are financially sustainable or not. Before, there were probably cases where people lacked the information or whatever, or out of a speed, just made decisions actually, and that should be addressed. So I think Africa will continue, obviously for development purposes, will be very, very important to China. And there's one actually fact that I think makes situation in Africa even more urgent. That's the demographic change in Africa. Because in the next 15 to 20 years, we have seen different estimates. There will be at least 1 billion more population in Africa. Imagine what kind of burden, food-wise or environment-wise, that would be for Africa. And don't forget, it's not only Africa's problem. When people don't have food and shelter, they move. So that's going to affect all of us, particularly Europe. And I think we are not really paying adequate attention to the development issue in Africa. And if we don't change, we're going to suffer the consequences. U.S. Trump and whether systematic decline or rise, we don't know. I think that's our collective problem, because a lot of domestic uncertainties in the U.S. That's big trouble for all of us, because we would like to have some degree of certainty in the U.S., but we just don't, because I mentioned to our colleagues in China. I have a friend who 2 years ago, after Trump got elected, got a lot of psychological distress because he had to read tweets every day, every morning, and that's not pleasant, most of the time. So that's a lot of uncertainty coming out of the U.S. Even after next year, even after Democrats can win back the White House, which I believe is likely, but still there will be uncertainties. Why? Because the last 70 years or so, global order is changing. Whether Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. Whether Trump or not, doesn't matter. It's going to change based on population, based on development, based on economic structure and technology, by the way. So I think, we don't know. I think U.S. Trump, we just have to sort of leave it aside, focus on ourselves, focus on our internal problems. And it's going to be important, but shouldn't be our 100% attention. The dollar, of course, nobody can replace the dollar now. But I think you are aware of that. European countries are not very happy with the dollar dominance system either. Obviously, because of Iran, you are the number 2, maybe importer of Iranian oil. We are also a big importer of Iranian oil. And nobody's happy. When nobody's happy, I think things will change. Of course, they don't change overnight. Nothing changes overnight. But I think there will be changes. So there will be a day when US dollar no longer becomes I don't know how soon and how dramatically, but I don't think it will be, it's no longer impossible to see that. So it's a bad idea to weaponize your dollar. You just think for yourself and making everybody else unhappy. It's never a good idea. Protests in the South China Sea and big issues, difficult issues, partly because it's a learning process. By the way, we don't speak English. Our language is Chinese. It's hard for us to understand, even much harder for us to express ourselves. I don't speak Hindi, right? So I cannot express myself if I'm talking to somebody from some other parts of the country. That's our problem. We need to learn. And there's a problem of communication. There's a problem of conflict of interests. And I think difficult to resolve, but not impossible. China, the Philippines, China, Vietnam, they need to find ways to address the issue, I think. But most importantly, peace and stability should be maintained in that region, because I understand India's trading route also is, going through that part of the world. So it affects everybody. So it's our responsibility to maintain the peace and the stability. And with that, then we can move to some solutions of the issues. So I think the good thing in the last few years, things have calmed down a little bit, and we hope that can be maintained.
So we have a few minutes left. So we have a few minutes left. Please be brief in your questions. I'll give the first one.
Professor, there's a question on the boundary issue. So there have been several rounds of talks, but it has not really gone anywhere. I mean, keep making statements, but there has been no real progress on the ground. So what, and as someone asked before, China has sorted its issues with everyone else, land boundaries. India is probably the one left, the big one in the real issue. So what is the thinking in China? Is it a deliberate attempt? Is something else going on?
The dynamics that are happening in the Persian Gulf today, with the kind of US-Iran equation that is panning out, it doesn't augur well for the entire world, even China and India, as far as the energy needs are concerned. What would be China's role in ensuring that such a conflict doesn't happen? Because it will be disastrous for the world. And secondly, you mentioned about the peaceful rise of China. But many of the actions that China has taken, such some incidents you mentioned of the South China Sea, with Japan, with the aspect of building up a very large army and the navy, don't go in consonance with what you mentioned that it's a peaceful rise. How would you balance these things out?
Sir, as we know, China has taken lease for Hambantota port in Sri Lanka as it could not repay the loans. And it's making huge investments in Nepal and Pakistan. Are we going to see China as another imperialistic and colonialistic country looking upon its policy towards small economic countries?
So thank you for the wonderful talk. After the 1962 war, there is tremendous suspicion within India regarding Chinese activities, and this suspicion has only been cemented by the military alliance you have with Pakistan. Do you think this is a factor that is underestimated by the Chinese government and the Chinese people, because they fail to understand the level of suspicion and the level of threat that the Indian people perceive? So whenever we talk about international cooperation on a grand level, whether it is the Belt and Road or whether it is aligning against the US on international fora, because the Indian government can only do large-scale activities when the public is behind it, and that is and the public is so suspicious of Chinese activities, and there is no communication from the other end. So while China expects everyone to adhere to its core interests, there is a feeling that China doesn't adhere to our core interests in that way. So can you tell something about that?
Okay, I try.
Just last, yes, sir.
In one of your slides, you have said BRICS is fading. How BRICS is slowly fading away and why?
Yes, so I think I'll give the final word.
Okay. Well, I have to sort of admit we see the boundary issue from a different perspective. Why? Because remember, we had a sort of a military clash conflict even with Soviet Union in the 1970s. We fought a war with Japan, obviously, for 80 years, longer than 80 years. But we moved on. We moved on in 1978. Not completely, but leaving aside history issues. Why? Because we valued the future. We valued the future. We valued development over boundary issues. It's a consensus. I think we made the right decision. If we continued to, I don't want to underestimate the importance of that. It's very, very important. But still, for us, the future is even more important. And I think that's how Chinese people think of not just the boundary issue, but also sovereignty and all that. So that also goes to South China Sea. We would prioritize development. We would like to shelve, so to speak, the disputes. As long as we don't escalate disputes, we are happy. Because there's oil to be, digged out, there's natural gas to be developed, there's trading to be, to grow. We value that much more. That's our kind of perspective. So I think it's not underestimating India's, understanding, perception, or anything like that. It's just we chose to look differently at this issue. And I think that's part of the reason why we cannot reach sort of a consensus. From my city, Guangdong, for me personally, as an academic, I don't think territory is important. I don't. I think robotics, machine learning, artificial intelligence is much, much, much more important than a piece of land from a pure instrumental kind of perspective. And you can grow your economy with artificial intelligence. You cannot grow your economy simply by keeping a piece of land. Not like before. It's a choice. So I think we made the choice. I think, obviously, I hope this can be resolved. How? I don't know, but I think we needed to develop a consensus in both of the countries. And I think I read a news story by quoting your Navy chief this morning by saying that China is doing all this artificial intelligence, robotics, and India can do better. You have talents, you have engineers. We in Guangdong, we have hundreds of Indian engineers, scientists. And I think that's the future. That's what will make you number one by 2049. The border will not make you number one, will not make us number one. Not underestimating the importance of that. We have to be clear. China Peaceful Rise. I think it's understandable why outsiders have all these concerns and whatever worries about China's rise. Why not? I mean, you are growing so fast. They don't speak Chinese. We are not easily, to communicate. Our system is not as yours, right? You have the largest democracy. You have all sorts of debates. We don't. Why? That's our choice. That's our culture. We believe, rightly or wrongly, I believe, in my personal view, open debate is not necessarily the best way to go about things. We look at the results. Can you deliver the results? If you can, we are pragmatic people. We follow you. If you cannot, then I don't have much confidence in you. That's how we look at the 2009 global financial crisis, right? You didn't deliver, and you now tell me what to do. Can we have confidence in you? Maybe not. So I don't think China is in a position to talk about the China model because we have not succeeded, ultimately. Wait until 2049, then we can answer this question. Not right now. But we have a little bit more confidence in our system. It's working, it's been working so far. We have problems, of course. So I think we chose a different system. Whatever its weaknesses, it's doing okay now. So I think that's part of the reason people have doubts. I think it's natural, and China should do its best to communicate much better, to clarify its intentions, and by calming some things down. There are things we can do. I think we realize that we can do more to let our partners and friends know it's not necessarily a threatening thing to have China around you. So, to that question, imperialism, that term I think is outdated, and we may have made some mistakes, investing wise and all that, but it's never our intention to do that kind of things. And I think for that kind of matter, I mean, the whole world has moved on. That period is behind us. Even for Sri Lanka, I think, let's say I have heard different explanations, and I going back to the earlier gentleman's, I do not necessarily believe every word printed in the Economist or whatever fake news, as Trump would say. So you have to see for ourselves. But I understand the consensus on that. That part should be addressed by China. I think that can be done. But that term, I think, is not the right term. BRICS fading, certainly, by what indicators? I think maybe Russia has been sort of stabilizing. I mean, Russia's economic structure is a little bit problematic because over reliance on energies, sector. So the performance has not been very stable. I think Brazil is maybe facing some challenge, but I think fading, in a sense, it means only the kind of economic sort of instability. The importance of BRICS or BRICS-like institutions, I think, will continue, and even more so. And by the way, BRICS is only one such type of, institutions. There are other types. G20 may be even more inclusive, another good platform. And India certainly has been doing very well. India, 2 years ago already, is the #1 growing economy in the world, and will remain strong for a long time. So I don't think BRICS as a sort of a platform is necessarily declining, but some members might have different challenges. So I think overall, I think the non-West, the East, so to speak, is continuing its rise, and that's the big global trend. I think we should pay attention to. 2 steps forward, 1 backward, 1 step. That's normal. Zigzags, very, very normal. But I think look at the big picture. I think we see a strong future.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. It was a pleasure hearing you, and it was very nice of you to engage with our audience so patiently and very, very deliberately, with you answering all the relevant questions, sometimes provocative, sometimes not so provocative, but you very patiently handled them. Thank you so much for coming. Please do keep coming. But I think one aspect of Sino-Indian relations which we need to build is to have greater exchange of ideas. We don't have enough students going to each other countries, enough exchanges of academics and other thinkers. So it's great of you that you could make it. Please keep coming. Thank you so much. Thank you, audience. Please join us for tea.
Thank you.